we're in chapter 26, but did anybody mark where we left off last week? Jane usually tells me, and she skipped out on me tonight. So 16. I thought that's where I was going to start. I thought that's where I had left off, but I know in my mind sometimes I wasn't 100% sure. It's a good group of folks here tonight. I appreciate all y'all coming out. Sure do. We're going to start in verse 16. Of course, a lot of this psalm is talking about the nation of Israel, and some of it is a dual prophecy, talking about Israel, but also talking about end times. And that theme kind of continues through some of Isaiah here, so we'll be talking about both as we move through this. But I wanted you to understand that up front. But in verse 16 it says, Lord, they came to you in their distress, talking about the nation of Israel. When you discipline them, and you can look at Israel's history, and we've mentioned this a number of times. I mean, they were constantly in and out of trouble with the Lord throughout their history, even up till now. It's been the same thing. Now, God did promise to bring them all back together, and, they became a nation again back in 1948. Actually, it's hard to believe, but that was just a little before my time even. But that's when they became a nation again, and they're back together now, but there's still problems ahead for them during the tribulation, and God has said He's going to save a remnant of them, remember? And the Bible mentions the number 1/3 of them will be saved during that time. So He says they came to the Lord when they were distressed, when they would sin against God and go serve other idols, or a lot of times they would seek protection from another country rather than seeking God for their protection. And God didn't like that because He wanted to be their God and He wanted to be their Father, and He wanted them to understand they could trust Him. But they just really didn't get around to it a lot. But when He would discipline them, and when they would have distress with this and He would discipline them, then they would come back to Him, and live for Him for a while. And this started way back in the Old Testament, folks. I mean, you go back to Genesis with this stuff. And see some of this going on. And then the book of Judges is all about this, where they would sin against God. They would be captured by another nation, and God would send a judge along to save them and bring them out of captivity. And that would last, sometimes in Judges, 40 years was a good number from what I remember. Might last 40 years, and then He'd do it again because they would sin again and look to somebody else again. So that's just been a constant thing with Israel. And you can even look in this century and the century before, and they've had a lot of problems with a lot of countries who have really persecuted them. We're all familiar with World War II, right, and the concentration camps and what Hitler did. But the Russians were they couldn't go to Russia because the Russians were doing a similar thing to them, even though Russia was one of our allies in World War II. So they really had nowhere to go. And it's been a constant problem for them. But why have they had the problem? This is what we need to get. Because they kept rejecting God. Okay? They kept on rejecting God. And so that created the problem for them. But He says when you disciplined them, they could barely whisper a prayer. They were so downtrodden, so beaten down, that basically all they could do was whisper to God. They didn't have the strength to do anything else. But the interesting thing is when they whispered to God, God heard them, didn't He? They didn't have to shout at Him. They just whispered, and He heard them. That's a good point for us to remember when we get in distress like that. And when we get to feeling bad like that, if we don't feel like we've got the strength to shout out to God, don't just whisper a prayer to Him. Just seek Him, talk to Him, because He's right there. It says, as a pregnant woman about to give birth rises and cries out in her pain. Once again, I don't know what that's all about, but some of you ladies I'm sure do. It's kind of the idea of how painful it is when we're in distress with God. Okay, it's just kind of giving you a picture of that. It says, we were with child, we writhed in labor, but we gave birth to wind. An interesting thing is, when a woman is in pain with childbirth, at some point in time, the child's going to be born, right? And what does that bring? It's almost like the pain's forgotten, isn't it? And it brings joy, And I think Christ is our example of that. I want you to turn to Hebrews 12:2 with me real quickly. And some of you probably know this verse. It's a very familiar passage of Scripture, Hebrews 12:2. And let's go back to the last part of verse 1. It says, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. We have to persevere. Why? Because there are going to be some problems, right? That we're going to have to work through. There's going to be some distress. There's going to be some anxiety. There's going to be other things going on, circumstances that we're going to have to persevere through, okay? So we need to run this race with perseverance. The race, it says, marked out for us, the race that God has planned for us, okay? It says, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. And then I wanted you to see this part. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross. You remember when Christ was in the garden. He struggled, didn't he? We've said it a number of times. He struggled to the point that he sweat drops of blood. There was so much distress and so much anxiety about what he was about to go through. But he did it because of the joy that God had set before him when he got through it. Do we understand that? He couldn't go around it. He couldn't bypass it. He couldn't go under it, and he couldn't go over it. He had to do what? He had to go right through it. Okay? And I'm here to tell you, and you already know this, I'm sure, but I want to remind us again, there are some things that we are not going to be able to bypass in this life. We're just going to have to go through them. I mean, if any of you in here have ever lost a child, I have, and some of you have. That's one of the worst things I've ever been through in my life. But we still had to go through it because it was there, right? For whatever reason, it was there, okay? And there are other things that we have to go through. I mean, there are people right now going through COVID. I mean, they can't bypass it. They got it, you know? So they've got to go through it, and hopefully they get through it. If they don't, I hope they're a Christian, if they don't make it through it. But, I mean, there are things like this in life that comes for us. But what we've got to focus on is the joy that God has ahead of us when we get through that thing, okay? If we focus on the situation and the circumstance, the COVID or the death of a loved one or our own sickness or cancer or all of these other kinds of things, if that's what we focus on, we're going to really struggle, aren't we? We're not going to have that joy that God has given us and that he wants all of us to have. That's his desire for us, is to have that joy. And so Christ is the picture of that. He did not want to go to the cross. We understand that, right? Based upon his struggle in the garden and his prayer to God, he did not want to go to the cross. But guess what he did? He went right through it, okay? And then God did what? Look here what it says. He says, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. That was the joy set before him, to be right back with his Father, right at his right hand, okay? And so God has a joy waiting for you. And he has a joy waiting for me no matter what we're going through right now. And I want you to see that and understand that. And I want you to trust that and lean on that, okay? And that's what God wants for you to do. So he says, we have not brought salvation to the earth, and the people of the world have not come to life. In other words, they're refusing to come to God because he's the only place where we can find life. You can't get life from anybody else, all right? It's only through Jesus Christ. Now, part of the problem was, what did God want with the nation of Israel? What did he want them to do? We know he wanted them to follow him and love him and be with him, but he had another purpose for them. Turn ahead in Isaiah to Isaiah 49 real quickly, and I'll show you that. I want to show you the purpose that he had for them. Isaiah 49, and look at verse 6. Isaiah 49:6, he says, it is too small a thing for you to be my servant to restore the tribes of Jacob and bring back those of Israel I have kept. He didn't want them just to be concerned, in other words, about themselves and their own families and their own nation. What did he want? Here it is. I will also make you a light for the Gentiles. That was his purpose in choosing the nation of Israel to be his people. He wanted them to be obedient and serve him so that what? The Gentiles would see what they were doing, and so that they would see how God was blessing the nation of Israel, so the Gentiles would come to him. That's what he says here at the end. He says, that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. God wanted everybody to come to him, Jews and Gentiles. But he wanted the Jews to be the light. And I think that may be one of the reasons why the punishment was so severe on Israel when they rejected God, because they didn't fulfill what he had set out for them to do. Okay? And so he says they've not been brought to salvation. They've not gotten it because of the unfaithfulness of the nation of Israel. Then in verse 19 he says, but your dead will live, Lord. Their bodies will rise. That's in contrast to what happens to the wicked dead, right? In the final judgment, when they are cast into hell. This is in contrast. Those who die in Christ will be raised to life. Somebody turn to Daniel 12:2 real quickly. Somebody turn to Daniel 12:2. And read it for me when you get there. All right, Paul, do it. Start again, because I think we had two readings. That's all right. Go ahead. Start again so they can hear you. Okay? That gives you the two sides of the coin on it. It tells you that those who follow God will come to life. Now I want you to turn to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. We can turn to this together. Chapter 4. And this is a passage of Scripture that I use a lot at funerals. And I think it's an important passage to use at the funeral of a Christian so that there's not so much despair about their death. All right? There really shouldn't be despair. Yes, we miss them, right? Yes, we're going to grieve some. But he says at the very end of this, and he wants us to encourage each other with these words. So I want to encourage you with these words. Start in verse 13, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Here it is. He says, brothers and sisters, we do not want you to be uninformed about those who sleep in death. We've talked about that before. He describes the death of a Christian as what? Falling asleep. That's a better picture, isn't it? Isn't that a more tolerable picture in our minds? He says, for those who sleep in death, so that you do not grieve like the rest of mankind who have no hope. Now, I can tell you, if there's somebody who doesn't know the Lord, you might want to grieve. Because they've got a bad outcome coming. That's why it's so important that we are diligent about trying to reach our family, about trying to reach our friends and those we know, and any others that God puts us in contact with. Because this is serious business. He says, for we believe that Jesus died and rose again. And so we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep in him. According to the Lord's word, we tell you that we who are still alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will certainly not precede those who have fallen asleep. In other words, those who have died or in the grave are going what? They're coming out first. Okay? Now, we know their spirit is already with God in heaven. He told the thief on the cross, this day you will be with me in paradise. I don't think he was talking about 1,000 years from now. I think he was talking about in a 24-hour day period. Okay? And so he said, this day you will be with me in paradise. So we know that our spirit goes to be with the Lord because what? Our fleshly bodies are put in the ground and they got to die. But on this day when we come out of these graves, you're going to be uniting your spirit with a glorified body. A glorified body meaning what? One that is eternal, one that cannot be killed. Okay? This body is in the one in which you will live forever. He says, for the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet call of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. After that, after they have risen, we who are still alive and are left will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And listen to this part. And so we will be with the Lord forever. With all of those who have already risen out of the grave, okay? Therefore, encourage one another with these words. So the idea is, yes, you may cry. You may feel bad about it. You may miss them. But remember, if they know the Lord, they're in heaven. And if you know the Lord and follow God, you'll be with them soon. And one of the ways I end funerals of Christians a lot of time is we don't have to say goodbye to this body that's here in this casket. We can just say, we'll see you soon. Because that's the truth of the matter. And getting at my age, starting tomorrow, according to what Aunt Elle's been telling me, my soon may be sooner than later. She's been telling the kids all day, your granddaddy's going to be officially old tomorrow. She'll catch me next year, by the way, then. Okay. So it says again, but your dead will live, Lord. Their bodies will rise. Let those who dwell in the dust wake up and shout for joy. Okay? Why? Because they're now reunited with their glorified bodies. And once that happens, they'll be with the Lord there forever in their glorified body. It says, your dew is like the dew of the morning. The earth will give birth to her dead. Once again, releasing the dead. And let me tell you something now. When Jesus Christ or whoever the angel blows that trumpet, and it's time for that to happen, there ain't no amount of dirt that can stop it. It's on top of those bodies. There's no amount of dirt that's going to be able to stop it. They're coming out of those graves, okay? Just as Jesus Christ came out of his grave. And then in verse 20, he says, go, my people, enter your rooms and shut the doors behind you. Hide yourselves for a little while until his wrath has passed by. So what I want you to understand is this. God's judgment and his wrath, yes, it's going to be terrible. It's going to be awful. Some of the circumstances we go through in this life seem terrible, don't they? And they seem awful. But what we've got to understand is with God, if we will hang in there with him for just a little while, this too will pass. At some point in time, it's going to pass. Now, I'll be honest with you. It may not pass till we go to heaven to be with the Lord, but it is going to pass. Do we get that? I mean, this is a really important message for us to get. He says, hide yourselves for a little while. And really the nation of Israel is going to do that during the tribulation time period. If you remember, we've told you this before, that they're going to flee to the mountains where God is going to protect them from the Antichrist. Okay? When he comes against them with all those armies, and then he's eventually going to return and destroy the Antichrist and all of his armies and protect that remnant that is left. Okay, so he's telling them to hide for a little while, and this too will pass. But that applies to anything we go through. It applies to anything that happens to us in this life. It is going to pass if you know Jesus Christ. Now, if you don't know Jesus Christ, you don't have this promise. You better get your heart right with God. That's the point. So that you can claim this promise. Verse 21 says, see, the Lord is coming out of his dwelling. Where is his dwelling? Where did it tell us he just went to? To be at the right hand of God the Father. So he's coming out of heaven, in other words, to punish the people of the earth for their sins. The earth will disclose the blood shed on it. The earth will conceal its slain no longer. In other words, I think one of the things he's talking about, one group of people that might fit in this category, remember he talks about with the Pharisees and the Sadducees how they had slain all the prophets and persecuted the prophets and all of that. I think that's one group he's talking about. Another group he may be talking about are those who are martyred for Christ during the tribulation time period. I mean, their blood has been shed, right? And so he's saying they will no longer be concealed, and those who've done this will no longer be able to conceal the fact that they're guilty and that they did this and that they killed the prophets and they slew these people who came to know the Lord during the tribulation. They won't be able to hide that. It will be revealed, and God will punish them, and he will discipline them. So the truth of the matter is, and we all know this, but I'm going to remind you again, you do know you can't hide anything from God, right? I mean, God knows all. He reads your very thoughts. Don't let that scare you. Just clean up your mind. You get what I'm saying? Huh? Just get your mind focused on right things and think on right things. And that takes care of the problem, right? That's what he wants you to do anyway. And that's what we all need to be doing anyway, because how many of you know what you think you may end up doing? There's a good chance that you may end up doing it. So be thinking good and righteous and pure and holy thoughts and all of that. All right, chapter 27. In that day, could be talking about usually it's talking about the end times here, and I think it is partly talking about the end times, but it could also be talking about the day when they go into captivity. Remember, Israel goes into captivity to Assyria, the 10 tribes, and the 2 tribes of Judah and Benjamin go into captivity to Babylon. You remember we've talked about that a number of times. That's just a reminder. But it says, in that day, the Lord will punish with his sword, his fierce, great, and powerful sword. Now, he did punish the Assyrians, right? And he did punish the Babylonians. Somebody conquered them. But also, this could be talking about the end times, because he's going to punish who else? The Antichrist and all his armies. He's going to destroy all of them, and then he's going to punish Satan himself. Okay? So he says, the Lord will punish with his sword, his fierce, great, and powerful sword. Leviathan, the gliding serpent, Leviathan, the coiling serpent, he will slay the monster of the sea. This is a reference to some sea creature. Some folks think that this is a crocodile, could be. I don't know. Some have claimed that it's some kind of a whale, but I want you to understand, either one that it is, it's also likened to Satan himself right here in the form of a serpent. Okay? The serpent is symbolic of Satan, the devil. All right? And so it could be that. In Job, it describes this beast as a powerful force. It describes this force as swallowing up the day of his birth, and as an untamable creature who rules over all the proud. That could describe Satan, couldn't it? But it could also describe an animal. It could also describe a crocodile. How many of you know that crocodiles have a problem with eating their young? At least the male part of that they do. Okay? And it talks about swallowing up their young. So it could be that's what it is, but I want you to make sure you understand also it's a picture of what Satan does. All right? Swallowing up people who follow him, because we've got to understand very clearly Satan is all about doing what? Destroying us. He's all about death and destruction, okay, and pain and hurt and all of those things, okay? So we need to understand that, and this is a picture, I believe, of what he's talking about with that, okay? And part of this is going to be fulfilled also at the end times when Satan himself is captured and he is destroyed. It says here the Lord's going to punish him with his sword, right? And so that's going to happen. If you will, turn back to Revelation chapter 19 real quickly. I think we need to tie this in to what's going on here. And we're going to tie it into the false prophet and Antichrist, and I want to tie it into Satan also. But look at chapter 19, and we're going to begin, let's begin in verse 19. It's talking about the return of Jesus Christ, and he's on the white horse. He's described as faithful and true, and he's returning to destroy sin and the Antichrist and all of that. In verse 19 it says, "And then I saw the beast and the kings of the earth, and their armies gathered together to wage war against the rider on the horse and his army." The rider on the horse is Christ, okay? And all the saints who are coming back with him. Who is the beast? Or the Antichrist. And I believe at this point, I think you're right, that the Antichrist is going to be indwelt by Satan himself, okay? But it's specifically speaking of the beast, usually is described as the Antichrist. Satan is described as usually a dragon, okay? So keep that in mind, all right? So it says, "But the beast was captured, and with it the false prophet." So you've got the Antichrist, and remember his false prophet was his right-hand man. And he's the one who put the image of the Antichrist in the temple and made all the people come and worship that image. He even made that image speak, remember, so that they would be deceived and they would follow the Antichrist, and they would bow down to him. So he's got both of those now, the beast, the Antichrist, and the false prophet. He says, "With these signs he had deluded those who had received the mark of the beast and worshipped its image. The two of them were thrown alive into the fiery lake of burning sulfur." What's that describing? Hell. Okay? That's hell. "The rest were killed with a sword coming out of the mouth of the rider on the horse, and all the birds gorged themselves on their flesh." That's an awful picture, isn't it? That's a rough ending, folks. That's a rough ending. Then go over. Now that takes care of the Antichrist, and that takes care of the false prophet. Now what about Satan himself? Turn over to chapter 20 and begin in verse 7, because this is what I believe Isaiah is describing here in these first couple of verses. The destruction of Satan. He says, when the 1,000 years are over. So Satan lives through the millennial kingdom after the tribulation, right? We got that? Okay, he's alive now. He's been tied up or chained or whatever God does with him for that 1,000 years. So there'll be peace on earth, but he's released from his prison, it says here, and he will go out to deceive the nations in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, and to gather them for battle. So he goes out deceiving one more time. He hadn't been doing this during the millennial kingdom because he's been what? God's had him imprisoned, all right, and kept him from doing this, but now he's released. It says in number, they are like the sand on the seashore. It didn't really take him long to gather a large army, did it? I mean, he's pretty influential. He's pretty deceitful. And they marched across the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of God's people, the city he loves. Talking about what city would that be? Jerusalem. Okay? But fire came down from heaven and devoured them. And the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of burning sulfur where the beast and the false prophet had been thrown, and they will be tormented day and night. How long? Forever and ever. You better get that ingrained in your head. Because not only is Satan and the Antichrist and the beast going to be there forever and ever, but who else is going to be there? Everyone who has rejected God. Everyone. That may be somebody next door to you. That may be somebody you see tomorrow at the grocery store. Okay? It may be somebody you call a friend. It may be somebody in your family. That's why it's so important we're telling people about this now. This is serious business, people. Do we get that? We can't just sit by and do nothing and keep our mouths shut. We've got to talk about Christ and spread the gospel. All right, so that's the end of the Antichrist, the false prophet, and Satan. All right, that it talks about. It says here, the Lord will punish with his sword, and he finally puts them in hell. Verse 2 says, in that day, sing about a fruitful vineyard. I, the Lord, watch over it. Okay? I think it's talking about his millennial kingdom here. Because there's peace on earth, right? It is being fruitful now. Finally, the nation of Israel is being fruitful. Isn't it sad that it takes them that long to get there? Is it a picture maybe of some of our lives and how long it took us to get to where we are with God? Huh? Kind of sad, isn't it? But that's what he's talking about. He says, sing about a fruitful vineyard. I, the Lord, watch over it. I water it continually. I guard it day and night. I think you could also put in here, he's not just speaking of Israel, but he's speaking of the church that is there in the millennial kingdom with him. Okay? That he's guarding it and watching over it day and night. He says, so that no one may harm it. How many of you know that if you're living faithful and you're in the arms of Jesus and you're under the wings of Almighty God, that you are absolutely protected from anything? If you're living faithful. Okay? Because if you remove yourself from the protection of his wings, and what will remove you from the protection of his wings? Sin will. If you do that, you got a problem. Okay? It said, if only there were briars and thorns confronting me, I would march against them in battle. I would set them all on fire, or else let them come to me for refuge. Let them make peace with me. Yes, let them make peace with me. So he's talking about really our decision with salvation to either accept him or reject him. If we accept him and we come to him, guess what we get? We get peace. Now, if you sin in your life as a Christian, how many of you know God's going to contend with you? There's going to be a battle. And he's going to do what he can do to get you back in a right relationship with him. Okay? And I think that's what he's talking about here. But he also is extending even during that time. I think a part of the reason for that contention and the discipline and all that God does for us is an invitation to come back to him. It's him pushing us back toward him. Don't fight the push. Okay? Accept it and come on back to him freely. All right? Get the sin taken care of in your life. Get forgiveness for the sin. And get yourself right with God. In the days to come, verse 6, Jacob will take root. Israel will bud and blossom and fill all the world with fruit. Now, I think that's going to be taking place during the millennial kingdom, but I think when he brought them back in 1948, it's setting up the time for that. When they became a nation back in 1948 and they came back together, I think he's setting them up for that. And then verse 7 says, has the Lord struck her as he struck down those who struck her? In other words, he basically destroyed Assyria. He basically destroyed Babylon. Remember, they were no longer a major nation anymore after God got through with them. And he used other nations to come and destroy them. He basically destroyed the Roman Empire. How many of you know that? How many of you know that the United States right now is living just like the Roman Empire did in its end? If you don't believe it, look at your history. Look what happened to them. Look what they did. Look at the laws that they made. Look at the way they lived their lives. Look at the immorality that was involved in the Roman Empire. And you'll see exactly what's going on today. But the Lord is saying, have I struck Israel like that? He did strike Israel, didn't he? But it was not in the same way as he struck Assyria and Babylon and the Roman Empire and others. Okay? He got rid of them, but Israel is still a nation. He kept bringing them back, didn't he? So even though he struck them, he didn't kill them like he did the others. And that's what he says here. Has she been killed as those were killed who killed her? As these Babylonians, they did kill a lot of Jews. The Assyrians did kill a lot of the Israelites. Okay? But God did not destroy them like he did the other nations. Why? Because they were his people. Okay? He had a mission for them, and he placed them here for a purpose. He said, by warfare and exile, you contend with her. In other words, these nations come against her, and they've been harassed by her, and God has used them to harass Israel, has he not? How many of you know that God brought Babylon for a purpose against Israel? How many of you know that he brought Assyria against Israel for a purpose? Huh? He says, by warfare and exile you contend with her. With his fierce blast he drives her out as on a day the east wind blows. They just came across them and took them. Okay? Killed a lot of them and took a lot of them captive. By this then will Jacob's guilt be atoned for, and this will be the full fruit of the removal of his sin. What in the world is he saying there? I think he's saying this. Persecution in all that was done to Israel was done to purify them and bring them back to God. Every bit of it was done, I'm going to say it again, it was done to purify them and bring them back to God. How many of you know that if you sin in your life, God is going to purify you? And how many of you know it ain't going to be pleasant at the time? Huh? There may be some persecution. There may be some heartache. There may be some other things going on. Now, I'm not saying all heartache and all persecution is because of that, but it is sometimes. You know, only you know the truth of that probably in your own life. But God's going to do what he can do because he loves you so much to get you back to where you need to be. And sin is never where you need to be. Okay? Never. Then he goes on to say, when he makes all the altar stones to be like limestone crushed to pieces, no Asherah poles or incense altars will be left standing. The fortified city stands desolate, an abandoned settlement, forsaken like the wilderness. There the calves graze, there they lie down. They strip its branches bare. That's exactly what happened to Jerusalem when the Babylonians came through. I mean, they basically destroyed it and turned it into like a wilderness. Remember, Nehemiah and Ezra had to come back and start by rebuilding the walls, didn't they? And getting the protection set up and then rebuilding the city. So it's a description of what he did. He just laid it bare, basically. When its twigs are dry, they are broken off, and women come and make fires with them. For this is a people without understanding. That's why they had to go captive. That's why these nations were sent against them. So their Maker has no compassion on them, and their Creator shows them no favoritism. Who are we talking about now? His chosen people. Do we get that? He's talking about his chosen people that he's now showing no favoritism to. Why? Because there are people without understanding. I started to say stubborn, and that's true. They're stubborn and hard-headed, and they want to follow other gods, and they want to follow and be like other nations. Can't you read that in the Bible several times? Where Israel wanted to be, I think of one example was when they wanted a king. Why'd they want a king? So they could be like everybody else. They don't want God as their king because nobody else had God as their king. Is that smart? That's kind of stupid, isn't it? That's being stubborn and hard-headed and wanting your way and not paying attention to God. So he says, for this people is without understanding, and because they're without understanding, their Maker has no compassion on them, and their Creator shows them no favoritism. And I want to end with this. You could put in there, for this people is without understanding, this people in America is without understanding. I mean, Gary was talking about it right before the service here, that we need to start standing up and writing our congressman and calling our congressman and standing up against some of these laws that are coming forth now. And I mean, they're coming forth right and left. I got news for you. If you're keeping up with Congress and you're keeping up with Biden and what he's doing, somebody said today they don't think Biden's written the first thing, but he sure has signed a lot, and that may be true. I don't know. But there's a lot coming down the pipe right now that is totally against the Bible and God. And we're just accepting it right and left. And just sitting back and watching it happen. What do you think God thinks about that? Well, I think he says this people is without understanding. I think that's what he thinks about it. And so what does he have for people without understanding? Their Maker has no compassion on them, and their Creator shows them no favor. If we ever thought we were a favored nation in God's eyes, you might as well get it out of your head, because it's no longer true. And so what do you think God's going to do here, folks? I mean, you can let your imagination run wild, but I'm just telling you clearly something's got to give somewhere at some point in time, and God's going to do something. I can't tell you what it is, but there's going to be some destruction. There's going to be some real problems here in this country because of the way we're headed and the way we've left God out. And I'm going to close with that tonight. I know that's not a good note to close on, but it's the absolute truth. Yes, Jeff?